Good morning. My name is Megan Magruder. I'm a partner at the law firm of King and Spalding in Atlanta, and I appreciate all of you being on today. We're going to cover legal issues for nonprofits that work with children. My experience in the area is having served on several boards for nonprofit organizations in Atlanta and also handling risk management issues for companies around the United States. We've developed some checklists and some strategies that we're going to discuss today. We're doing this program for the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. The mission of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is to maximize the impact of pro bono engagement by connecting a network of attorneys with nonprofits in need of free business legal services. There's a slide that sets forth the criteria that are necessary to be a client of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, and eligibility and other information can be found on the website for the organization. This webinar presents general guidelines for Georgia nonprofit organizations and should not be construed as legal advice. Always consult an attorney to address your particular situation. So let's review the main topics that we're going to cover today. We're going to start with going over common legal risks faced by nonprofits that work with children. And when we go through those risks, we're then going to identify a variety, which of course will depend on the age of children that you may be dealing with and other factors. But then we're going to talk about operational strategies that you can implement to minimize the risk your organization may face, as well as the role of insurance in a risk management strategy. To get your attention, but not to frighten you, I wanted to give you some examples of recent litigation involving nonprofit organizations, really as a demonstration of the kinds of risks that nonprofit organizations face. In the first case on this slide, Comprehensive Behavior Health Center in East St. Louis, the litigation involved failure to accommodate an employee who had multiple sclerosis and wasn't given reasonable accommodation as required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So with everything that you're dealing with in your organization, this case highlights the importance of understanding the ADA and how it might apply to your employees. In the next case, Dharmar Services in Indianapolis, this is a problem that the nonprofit faced in connection with allegedly failing to properly do background checks, train and monitor employees, and it turned out a former employee had a felony sexual misconduct problem that was not found, and there's litigation over that. Similarly, we're all familiar with the issues facing several of the Catholic archdioceses for, again, failing to identify problems and or covering up problems. In the Deerfield Academy case, this is a case that gives you an example of how long ago these claims may have happened, but they're still not barred. This is a case that occurred 30 years ago, but the school was still facing litigation, expensive defense, and eventually settled the case. In the Big Brothers Big Sisters litigation, two examples. The first case they face involved problems with a volunteer allegedly sexually abusing children in the organization's care, and separately a problem with mentors in their organization. And in the second lawsuit in Pennsylvania, they face that case is of interest also because the case was brought not just against the local chapter, but also the national chapter, and the court maintained the claims against both. All of these litigation matters, these are just some examples to show you that there can be terrible media PR issues for nonprofits when these allegations are made, even if they're ultimately not proven to be true, and the cases are very costly to defend. So now let's move to looking at the risks that nonprofits face just generally across the board. And if you're in a nonprofit environment, this is nothing new to you, but you understand the challenge of having limited funding, limited staff, space, and time, and often having to rely on many volunteers as opposed to having full or part-time employees. In addition to the other operational risks that all businesses face, including in the case of nonprofits, often challenges in having the time to do proper training or the time to do proper monitoring or supervision. Because our focus is on nonprofits working with children, we also included this identification list of heightened risks when nonprofits serve at-risk populations, such as children, who are among the most vulnerable populations, but they're also disabled, the poverty issues for children, foster children, undocumented immigrant children. A recent report that we've cited here also says that there's a heightened risk because of the 62.8 million people in the United States who volunteer at least once annually. And this is a heightened risk for reasons that we'll get into more in the presentation, but obviously nonprofits serving an at-risk population such as children often are heavily reliant on volunteers and need risk mitigation strategies to address these heightened risks. Some statistics that we just drew on the most recent report, which is a 2012 report about volunteers that you may be using. And in fact, these statistics relate to organizations that are actually doing background screens. It doesn't include the additional data that might be included if you were looking at nonprofit organizations that were not doing background screening. So every 43 hours, a registered sex offender attempts to obtain a position at a nonprofit. And we know that very often, unfortunately, that they may be targeting nonprofits who have children or other vulnerable populations. Every 37 hours, a background screening check reveals a murder offense. Nearly every 30 minutes is revealed a drug conviction. And this last statistic is that over a period from 2007 to 2011, there were about 8.8% of the background checks that revealed some criminal convictions. So these are the challenges. These are the very real challenges when you're recruiting and depending on volunteers in your organization. Now we'll identify common legal risks for nonprofits that specifically work with children. And I want to state at the outset that we're going to spend some time in the first part of the presentation on risk. When you are developing a risk management approach for your company, whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit organization, it's really important to identify the risks, because by identifying the risks, you can then think about mitigation strategies, whether they're going to be by contract, by insurance, or other ways. We'll talk about it in the presentation. And these are not meant to frighten you, and we certainly don't want you to have any hesitation to do the very important work with children. It's just meant to be issue spotting, so you can go through this yourself and say, that might be a risk for my organization, and what risk mitigation should I be thinking about? And because not all of these will apply. But risks to the children you serve include the possibility of emotional or physical injury, medical issues that may arise, sexual abuse allegations. You also often have to deal with problems with employees and volunteers, like in the cases we looked at where there might be allegations in a lawsuit of negligent supervision of the children or intentional acts that cause injury of one of these types to children. You also potentially face risk to your organization itself That can be claims made against your board of directors. These cases are very rare, but if there's some allegation the board should have taken some action and failed to do so, all of these can give rise to claims and issues that can drain financial resources. Let's now focus specifically on the types of emotional injury that you want to be aware of when working with children. We have the potential for verbal abuse, discrimination, and harassment. We find that most often in populations of older children. You also, if your organization has a code of conduct, and we certainly recommend that you do, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation, you have the potential for code of conduct violations that can lead to emotional injury or other kinds of problems of harassment against the children. And bullying is an issue. Unfortunately, more and more we are finding that although these issues vary among age groups, you need to be aware of how your employees and volunteers are interacting with your children, particularly older children. Cyberbullying and the use of social media is more and more an issue. We're going to talk about the importance of policies in that regard to help mitigate and diminish that risk for your organization, especially if you're working with teenage children. Looking at the possibility of physical injury and identifying for your organization where might you have some risk around physical injury to the children in your care. That would include activities such as sports and outdoor activities, arts and crafts, for example. Are you using sharp instruments, or are there other ways, use of scissors that might be too sharp? Could the children be hurt that you need to think about how might we change how we approach this activity to diminish that risk? Cooking, transporting children in vehicles. We'll talk a little bit more about ways to mitigate that risk specifically. Children can hurt each other, obviously, just in interactions among a group of children. And then, of course, you face also potential accidents on your premises, and we want to talk about mitigating those risks as well. The medical risk slide is to ask you to think about and prepare for these kinds of issues. You want your staff who are interacting with the children to be aware of the physical risks we talked about, the medical risks, but also there are going to be children with mental illness, and they need to be trained and able to deal with mental illness for children, chronic ailments, allergies, particularly if you're serving food to children. That has become an increasing issue. Differently abled children, sick children. Have you thought about policies concerning when your children are sent home or when they're kept in your care if they're ill? Vaccines. Do you have all the vaccination records for the children in your care? Do you know what vaccines they should be having before they're in your care under your supervision, and do you make sure those are kept up to date? Do you provide for dispensing of either over-the-counter drugs or prescription drugs to the children? Because if you do, you need to, again, make sure your staff is properly trained, that you have policies about when any kind of medication will be dispensed to a child. Sexual abuse. This has been a big issue for nonprofits dealing with children. As you saw from the examples of litigation, it's very often related to allegations of sexual abuse. And we do know that predatory child molesters may actually be focused on your organization if you serve children. So you need to have a heightened awareness that this is very unfortunately a risk because you're serving this more vulnerable population. Also, child pornography and internet criminals pose a risk to nonprofits. So are you thinking about how you can supervise and monitor for this kind of problem? You especially need to pay attention not only to the internet risks, but also just one-on-one situations in your organization. Are there any times when a child or young person might be left in a changing area unsupervised? You want to make sure that you're identifying those potentials and looking for risk mitigation strategies around that. Other common risks include just generally making sure your organization meets state licensing requirements. There are several that apply to organizations that deal with children. There are guardianship issues you need to consider and plan for. For example, who has the right to pick up the child? You must have this in your policies and procedures. You want to develop documentation so that you are never releasing a child to an unauthorized adult. Consider how you plan to deal with divorced parents. Have policies around that, again relating to who can pick up the child and when. And it's more complicated, but it just requires focusing on it and thinking about how you will be very confident that when a child is released, even to a parent with custody, that it's at the time the child should be with that particular parent. You also have to consider harassment and discrimination issues for your children, your employees and volunteers, and that this can happen through social media, not just in conversations or interactions at the organization. So, for example, if there's the possibility of inappropriate comments of a racial or sexual nature by employees, do you have policies around that your employees are trained on and they're reminded of, and that they are enforced in the case of any violations? All of these issues, if they're not managed, can lead to litigation and claims that your organization will have to defend. Other risks specifically relating to volunteers, employees in your organization are the possible accidents not just to the children but volunteers or employees off premises, particularly maybe when they're being transported or transporting children to an activity or a field trip. Lawsuits that you have to deal with include some of the types of litigation we talked about earlier, but also claims against officers, directors, volunteers, or employees for negligence in failing to identify risks and failing to then have these mitigation strategies or at least policies and procedures that you enforce to try to reduce these risks to the children. You also have to consider employment practices, making sure that, like the example of the litigation involving the American with Disabilities Act, are you in compliance with the ADA? Are you doing everything you can to prevent any claims relating to discrimination in your organization? And breach of fiduciary duty, that's a claim that might be made against your board of directors or officers in your organization. Officers and directors have duties that relate to a fiduciary nature, and they can be mitigated with some of the operational strategies we've talked about and we'll talk about more. Also with insurance, like directors and officers insurance, and we'll talk about more about that later too. You also should think about property damage and theft. Do you have plans through your insurance or other strategies to mitigate the chance of theft of assets that are important to your operation, and a strategy for continuing your operations if you have to deal with any property damage due to flood, fire, something of that nature. Let's now turn to having looked at risks, and I hope that this helped you start to think in your organizations, where are your risks and where do you need to focus on mitigating those risks, and where might you need to get some more policies and procedures in place. And now let's talk about operational strategies you can actually implement to minimize those risks so you can better serve the children. And there's no cookie cutter approach. This depends on the the children you're dealing with, it depends on their income levels, their ages, and other factors, but we'll go through all of these. We'll talk about participant agreements and how that can help you minimize liability and minimize risk. Background checks, what are the best practices around that? Best practices around waivers, those are waivers of liability that you'll get signed. Employee manuals, written procedures, social media policies, and not listed on this slide, but another really good operational strategy I'd like you to just note is a good board of directors can really be helpful as for an organization. Your executive director or your CEO could be a really fabulous, charismatic individual. I hope some of you are watching the program, in fact. But you may know that your skill set relates to fundraising or something along those lines, and you want to put around your CEO or your executive director a board that has great talent legally, great talent in finances, great talent in human resources, HR issues. All those people sitting on your board will help you with a lot of these potential risks because you can brainstorm with them. And I encourage you to develop a board of directors with various professional competencies as a way to mitigate and minimize risks. Let's turn now to participant agreements. These are the documents that organizations that deal with children will want to have parents or guardians signed. These documents should clearly address the services that you will be providing, rules that the parents or guardians as well as the children need to comply with. Codes of conduct are a really good part of a participant agreement, particularly I would say in your teenage population, because you want to address in code of conduct issues such as bullying, use of social media, whether or not weapons are allowed on the premises, restrictions on those types of things, restrictions on drug use, and including what the consequence of violations will be. You want parents to clearly understand, just for example, if their child is found with a handgun on your premises, that child will no longer be able to come participate in whatever the activity is, that's a zero tolerance rule if that's the case for your organization. But this is the agreement where you want to spell out all those issues. You want it signed by parents. When you do this agreement, I'd like to encourage you as a best practice to do it on a regular basis, maybe annually. Be aware not to let these just roll over if children are coming on a year-round basis to your organization, because obviously lots of things can happen in the family. There can be divorce, there can be change of guardianship, there can be changes in medical situations for kids. So make it a best practice to keep this routinely updated. And that's a nice time for you to update emergency contact and healthcare information. That changes for children, obviously, over the years. If you're providing infant and child care records, this is a good time to get their updated vaccination records. More and more with teenagers even, there are updated vaccines that you're going to want to require for those children, and getting it done at the time you have a participant agreement signed on is a great way to make sure you've got that information accurate. So that's participant agreements as an operational risk mitigation strategy. Let's now talk about best practices around background checks for your employees and your volunteers. There were some frightening statistics we looked at the beginning of the presentation in terms of the numbers of really criminals or the kind of people that might target your organization that you need to be able to identify and not bring into your company as an employee or a volunteer. Georgia law, as you probably know, requires a criminal background check for anyone who works directly with children. So daycare centers, for example, have to do this as a matter of Georgia law. But make sure if you're working with children that you have a lawyer involved in advising you as to what your requirements are under Georgia law on criminal background checks. Ask volunteers if you can to pay for these. They can be expensive if you have a number of volunteers. And one way we know some organizations have been able to ask volunteers to pay for it. If that's feasible, that's something you could think about, because you've seen from the statistics how important it is for you to know the background of the volunteers that are working with your children. And also remember to get written authorization from any applicant, an employee, or a volunteer under the Federal Credit and Reporting Act before performing a background check. Some more information about background checks. This will give you, if you're not familiar with it, some education employment status. Maybe you can double check whether this corresponds with what they've told you in a resume, for example. It'll identify criminal history, driving records, DUI convictions. The DUI and driving obviously is very important if you're going to have an employee or volunteer driving, transporting children. The limitations, though, on background checks are that they typically only go back 7 years, so you won't find everything. And there are also national databases beyond the Georgia check. And because Georgia attracts people from all over, you'll want to know if there's a criminal record in another state, so you may want to check national databases as well, and conduct background checks for employees and volunteers. But this next slide shows not just on the limitation, such as not going back far enough or a limited geographic area. What we want to emphasize is it's critical to get a background check, but it's not something that you can rely on exclusively. It is not a substitute for interviewing these people. The way you would interview employees, you should try to interview your volunteers in the same depth with the same care. Checking references, just as you would if you were going to have someone care for your own child, you want to check references for anyone who will be working with children in your care. These are strategies that should something come up, should there be allegations around something happening in your organization, if you're able to demonstrate in defending against those cases, not only did I do background checks, I did in-depth interviews, I checked references. These are all things that will aid in your defense, and why we think it's so important for you to consider these as ways to limit and minimize risk. Be sure that you have appropriate guidelines and employee manuals are in place. Another great way to use your board of directors, have them help review your employee manuals. Are they up to date? Do they have the best practices for organizations? Train volunteers and employees. You want to have a training program that goes over all your guidelines, goes over your code of conduct, and then you want to have in place supervision. Supervision is how you protect, again, against risks and any potential litigation. So that's operational strategy around background checking and the limitations around it, but other things you also want to do in addition to background checks to protect the children in your care. The next tool that you can use is waivers of liability. Waivers are like an advanced form of what you might remember as a permission slip that you would have for a field trip when you're in school. But these are enforceable under Georgia law, and it allows you to get consent from parents and guardians as a best practice to protect your organization against lawsuits, and also set expectations of both parents, guardians, and also children, teenagers. In some cases, you may want children over a certain age to also sign some of these documents. So for example, if you're going to take children swimming or hiking, it allows you to spell out to parents and guardians what the risk of that activity might be and have them waive, sign a form that basically says, I understand these are the risks and I waive liability. It should be in very clear, unambiguous language, in plain English. Remember, if you have any families where children are in your care whose first language is not English, you also have to think about that because you may need to have someone put the waiver into Spanish or whatever language is appropriate. You will be held responsible if you know that they are not English speaking and you have them sign a document they didn't understand. That probably is not going to be enforceable. It's going to be your responsibility to make sure that the parents and guardians understand what they're signing. I have been asked before about electronic signatures. I think it's really important that you're able to verify that those signatures are from the parent and guardian, so I would discourage you from doing that if you can avoid it, because we do see instances, not with young children, where it's not as much an issue, but maybe with a teenager who wants to participate in a program, cannot or is reluctant to get a parent to sign the permission slip, and you just have to be aware that the best practice would be actually being able to have it brought in and signed by the parent or guardian for you. Types of waivers can address all kinds of issues, so this is another thing you should take some time to think through in your organization. What are the risks that we've talked about where you might want a waiver signed by a parent in addition to the hiking and swimming? You might be providing medicine. We talked about dispensing medicine. That might be addressed in a waiver. Any kind of liability. You want to obtain consent for treatment if you will be dispensing medicine. That can be in your participant agreement. That can also be part of a waiver as part of a participant agreement. Getting waivers signed right before an activity or something like that is also a good time, again, to update health insurance information from parents. Make sure you've updated contact numbers. If children will be transported, it's really important for you to get a waiver. This can help you if there are gaps in your automobile insurance, for example. And there are situations I'll mention where maybe a waiver won't be enforced. For example, if the parent isn't English speaking, if you do other things like your insurance, it's sort of a backup to the waivers if they're not enforceable. You have to think about if you're going to be giving children food that you may need a waiver because of the food allergies kids can face. Field trips, sports, and other physical activities, as we've discussed, are all, if these are things that you're doing with the children, these are things that you'll want to protect yourself with waivers. Georgia courts generally do enforce a written waiver, and no considerations required. In other words, no money or other consideration needs to be exchanged. You simply provide the care for the child or the service for the child, and the waiver releases you of liability. But the limitation would be not only non-English speaking or other reasons why it's not enforced because they didn't understand, maybe it wasn't written clearly, but also if you have a situation where an employee drives the children and is found to be drunk and you fail to supervise, so if there's some negligent supervision or other claim, intentional harm to a child, then the waiver may not be enforceable as a matter of public policy. So they don't substitute for the other things that you need to do. You have to do all of these risk mitigation strategies that you can, but waivers are another way to protect your organization and a good best practice. Let's look now at another operational strategy that is important for you to consider when you're working with children, which is your employee manual and volunteer policies. When you have these, and we recommend that you always do, It's not enough to have it on the bookcase or in the file folder. It's really important that you develop these rules and policies and you train on them and you train regularly on them and you enforce them. If it's found that you have great policies but you've never trained on them and never enforced them, it won't do you any good. So this is something that has to be sort of actively looked at on a regular basis, and you need to have confidence that the employees and volunteers understand what you require. So the rules regarding interactions with children could include whether or not there's permission to take photographs of or video the children, contacts that the children might have through the nonprofit or through other access to the internet, employees and volunteers gift policies. Are you going to allow them to take gifts from parents or not? Child-adult ratios. What do you require in terms of one-on-one situations when a child can be alone with an employee or volunteer, when there needs to be more than one person there? The same with regard to when children would be allowed to be all with the same gender child as opposed to boys and girls together. What situations do you have in your organization where that happens? Where might there be a risk? What are your policies around that? Code of conduct and code of ethics. Many organizations have these. I talked about it a little in the beginning of the presentation. This is again where you can spell out no tolerance for weapons, drugs, alcohol, smoking, swearing, harassment, any clothing expectations you may have. Then you need to get the employees and volunteers to sign. Typically, a best practice is to sign that they understand, have read the rules, understand them, and will comply with them. And make sure, again, that these manuals are also written in plain English so that you can expect that the employees and volunteers understand them and can comply with them. Another operational strategy to help mitigate your risk is around written procedures in the event of accidents or incidents. How you would do this is to develop for your organization written procedures that your employees and volunteers know about and have readily available. Because we all know that accidents, particularly with children, accidents will happen. You want to train your employees and volunteers to follow the procedures, make sure they're easy to understand, and in advance you can have templates that are incident reports ready so that volunteers and employees can fill these out, and these will describe what happened, where it happened, what you think the whole reason for the accident, what was done in response. And this can be helpful if children need follow-on care or counseling. It does protect you in the event of claims because you've documented in real time what happened. It assists when you have to make claims on your insurance policy because you've well documented the incident. And this is something that can be on your computer, easy to access, and we think it's a really helpful and easy to implement strategy to limit risk and mitigate the possibility of litigation and cost. Another strategy that isn't on this slide, but we have dealt with recently with a nonprofit and wanted to mention to you is what we would refer to as disaster or crisis planning, because if there is a tornado or if there is another event that strikes your organization, say during operation, during the daytime when the kids are there, we'd like to see you have in place plans for how to unite the children with parents. Think about Snow Jam and how every company in Atlanta was struggling with how do I get the kids to the parents and what's the safe way to do that. So think about that. Think about how you're going to operate in the event of a natural disaster like that. It's One of the things that we just after the the situation in Atlanta where children and families are stranded and organizations are struggling with how to get them together, we started thinking this is good to plan in advance how you're going to do it, make sure the parents understand how it's going to be done, and everybody has good communication about that because things like that can happen. Now we're going to turn to the final section of the presentation, which relates to methods to mitigate all these risks through insurance. So you've gone through your organization, you've identified all the potential risks because of dealing with children, you've implemented these operational strategies. Now, backing up all of that is the possibility of purchasing insurance. And insurance can cover a number of different risks that you face. The property coverage is what's called first-party coverage. Property insurance is what covers your assets, your facility. So it's the insurance that you as an organization might make a claim on. That's why it's called first-party. So if you have fires, floods, other kinds of losses, property insurance covers that. General liability coverage is what we sometimes refer to as third-party insurance, because that insurance covers you for claims by third parties, like a parent filing a lawsuit against your organization. General liability would provide covering the cost of the defense of that litigation and any settlement or judgment. So it's third-party protection from lawsuits. Workers' compensation insurance covers employee injuries. Automobile liability coverage covers your automobiles or other vehicles you might use to transport children. Professional liability coverage is also referred to as errors and omission insurance. So if you're providing professional services in your organization, such as counseling, you might want to consider professional liability coverage. That would protect you, for example, if a child committed suicide and there was a claim that one of your counselors maybe had some causal connection to the child's suicide. Errors and omissions coverage would protect you in that case. Directors and officers liability coverage. Again, this rarely happens for nonprofit organizations dealing with children, but this insurance protects your directors, your board of directors individually, and it also protects your officers from claims that they may have breached a fiduciary duty that they owed. So let's drill down more specifically on these policies. The general liability insurance that I mentioned, some special considerations there. This is the third party for protecting you against lawsuits. Look specifically, if you have these policies or obtaining them, who is the named insured. Make sure that it extends to cover allegations that might be brought not just against your employees and your organization, but maybe volunteers. You also might assume your volunteers or employees have personal insurance that would protect them, but they don't always. So it's a good idea to understand how your insurance might also cover some of those claims. Look at the exclusions in these policies and make sure you understand them, because who is a named insured and what the exclusions say can be sometimes negotiated with your insurance company. So you don't need to accept the policy as it is printed sort of in an automatic form way. You can request, particularly if you're working with a broker who's helping you get the insurance, you can request that the exclusions are made more clear. For example, if it excludes athletic activities, you can be really specific and say, well, my children that are in my care are going to play in the gymnasium after school. I need to make sure my insurance covers that. Or they're going to be on a playground. I want to make sure that's not excluded by this exclusion for athletic activities. Let's make very clear when you say athletic activities what you mean, and let's make sure my insurance covers playground or field trips or other things that your kids may be doing. Think about coverage if you have fundraisers. Are you serving alcohol? Are people leaving your premises under the influence of alcohol? Make sure your insurance protects against that if that's the case for your organization. Workers' compensation will be needed for employee workplace injuries. That will not be covered with your general liability insurance. Looking at automobile liability issues on the insurance you might buy for protecting your vehicles. Be sure if your organization transports children that if you're using employee or volunteer vehicles, that those are also covered and protected, because the litigation could be filed against your organization if a volunteer is transporting a child. It could be filed also against the volunteer, but it can also be filed against both of you. So you'll want that kind of protection in your automobile insurance policy. Be sure, again, to get waivers from parents that they understand the risk of transport to sort of back up your insurance. Another issue on automobile liability, we want you to think about donated vehicles, because often these are older vehicles. Make sure they have proper seat belts. Georgia law requires proper safety child restraints for children under the age of 8. Make sure that you are complying with these laws that regarding transport of children. You can face fines if you're out of compliance, as well as problems claiming on your insurance if you're out of compliance. So it's really critical that you understand what you need to comply with and all your vehicles are in compliance. The next policy I wanted to give you some heads up on the issues on the professional liability, or what I called errors and omissions. You may hear it called Eno Insurance and Eno Insurance, and this is the last that we'll cover in terms of the insurance that you might want to look at. These policies can provide coverage for sexual harassment, breach of fiduciary duty claims. They also protect personal assets. So let's say a claim is made against your board members individually. If there is no D&O insurance, potentially directors have personal assets that could be reached if there's a judgment against them. And this is an issue too, just in getting good quality people on your board, because it's often a deterrence to individuals. If you don't have D&O coverage, they may not want to join your organization's board. So this is a good way to protect them and protect your organization. So that is the end of our presentation in terms of legal risks and strategies around minimizing those risks for nonprofits working with children. There are a lot of other resources available to you on this topic from the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. And we also may have time for questions if you have any questions.
Okay, well, we have a few questions. First of all, while we were speaking, there was a question about harmless clauses, and just because that's a different term that we're going to flavor, I thought we might want to clarify what hold harmless clauses and how practical they are.
Yes, hold harmless clauses are often found in waivers of liability. It's just another legal term that says that the parent or guardian will hold harmless the organization from any harm that occurs. It's not quite as powerful as going all the way and saying that they waive all risk and all liability. So we'd encourage you to kind of, if you have hold harmless clauses, make sure that you get even stronger language to make sure that they waive their right to sue for any harm that may come to the child.
And we also have a question about independent contractors.
That's a great question. And if you have yes. The question is, how do these strategies and risks relate to independent contractors who might be on your premises and working with children? And that's a great question because a lot of you probably do have teachers or counselors that are coming on the property and you're not hiring them as employees, but they're coming on as contractors. I would encourage you to have written agreements with those individuals and push any liability that could attach through their actions to them rather than your organization, and make very clear in the documentation and get lawyers to help you with this. The pro bono partnership can help you if you're eligible for their resources and lawyers, but make sure that you try to isolate to the extent you can any responsibility for liability or harm to the independent contractor in their contract as opposed to your organization. That's another way, if you can use independent contractors and you can get them to take on the liability and you can get them to get their own insurance, that's another way that you can maybe protect your organization. It's not always feasible, but you can also require them to maintain certain types and levels of insurance.
Another question, in one of the presentations you talked about the American business school and so on. Can you provide some advice about the steps that organizations should take to make sure that things
That would require consulting. I'm sorry, thank you. The question was, when we talked about making sure your organization is in compliance with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there are actually other laws that we talked about in the program that you have to be sure you're in compliance with. The only way that I know that you can be sure of that is to consult with a lawyer to make sure that there's no issues that you need to be aware of. In terms of ADA, that would specifically relate to if you have knowledge that an employee has a chronic ailment or disability, and the law would potentially impose requirements on you to reasonably accommodate those disabilities, and you would need to consult with a lawyer for that. All right, well, thank you all very much. Feel free to contact the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta with any follow-up questions.